Hi, I'm Jack Inman, and I'm going to tell you today how you can close a real estate transaction like a pro. So, every year I see hundreds, if not thousands, of real estate transactions and real estate contracts. And it's pretty easy just by looking at the real estate contract to tell whether this comes from a real estate agent that is seasoned, that has decades of experience, or whether it comes from somebody who's brand new. And so in this short video, I'm going to tell you how you can look like a seasoned professional, even if you're relatively new to the business. But even if you have experience, watching this video hopefully will give you some insight into some tips and tricks that you may not already be utilizing. So first thing to do, and this is going to sound pretty obvious, but it's important and a lot of agents don't do it. When you send your real estate contract to your closing attorney, make sure you send the entire contract. So send all the auxiliary forms, any addendums. If you already have amendments, just send everything over. And also, if you've already sent in your earnest money to, say, the other side or the other closing attorney, if you have a copy of that, it'd be great to send that in too. If not, don't worry, we can get a copy from the other side on our own. And then going along with that, make sure that you actually do draft all the appropriate addendums and make sure that they're signed in the proper places. And as always, if you need any help drafting anything, if you have any questions, we are experts on contract drafting. We went to school for it. We've been doing it for years. We know what we're doing, and we'd be happy to share anything that we know, and we'd be happy to help you draft a contract or any addendum or amendment. Secondly, and again, this is going to sound like an obvious thing, but we see a lot of agents that don't do it. Make sure you have the buyer and the seller's names into the purchase and sale agreement. So a lot of times, the buyer or the buyer's agent is the one that's writing the contract. And so generally speaking, the buyer's name is almost always on the contract. We've never really seen it where they don't put the buyer's name on the contract. But a lot of times the seller's name is not on the contract. So take the time to figure out who the owner of record is. And I have a separate video to show you how to find the owner of record. I'll put a link to that video down below. But take the time to figure out who the owner of record is and put that as the seller's name on the purchase and sale contract, on the offer. Also, you'll notice that when you go down towards the middle of the purchase and sale agreement, there is a part to put the name on deed, and make sure that's filled out and make sure that that's how the buyer actually wants to take title to the property. You can always change that later on, but it's good practice to have that filled in on the front end and to have it filled in correctly if you can. And all right, final point here, make sure you have, if you have multiple buyers, make sure that all of their names are listed on the contract. Because when we do our closings, we're going to do a basic background check into everybody who's associated with this purchase and sale. So we're going to be looking into the seller's background and into every single one of the buyer's backgrounds. And we're looking for judgments. We're looking for anything that can affect the transaction, anything that can affect the sale of the property. So if you don't put all the buyer's names on the front end, it may delay closing because we may get to, down the road, maybe a few days before closing. And if then we find out that there's another buyer, we have to hit the pause button and do a search under that buyer's name. And if nothing comes up, then it's fine. It won't delay closing. But if something comes up and we have to clear that judgment, make sure that's not the same person or whatever we have to do, it could delay closing. So best practice, give us all the names that are going to be, all the buyers' names up front so that we can do our background checks early on. Now, next up is earnest money. It's pretty rare that people don't ask for earnest money. I think it's pretty standard in almost every contract. I can't think of a contract that I've seen that hasn't had an earnest money. Well, there's been a few that are between family members. But generally speaking, most of the time the earnest money is due within 3 to 5 business days. So you want to give the buyer time to put the earnest money down. And usually the amount is somewhere between 1 to 2% of the purchase price. And it varies depending on market conditions, right? If it's a seller's market and the seller can basically dictate all the terms of the contract because they have so many buyers trying to buy, then it might make sense to put down a larger earnest money deposit. And conversely, if it's a buyer's market, you might be able to get away with even less than 1%, maybe just a $500 or $1,000 earnest money deposit. It just depends on the market. And then closing costs, right? So if you are representing a buyer and you're asking for the seller to pay some closing costs, or occasionally we've seen it vice versa, just depends on the market condition, make sure you put in there, clearly that you're asking for these closing costs, and make sure you put the dollar amount. Is if you fail to do that, or if you hide it in some part of the contract and the other side doesn't notice it, it could cause problems down the road. So you want to make sure that it's in there clearly, and you want to make sure that it's written properly so that everybody is aware of what you're asking for and that there's no ambiguities as to what closing costs you are wanting to get from the other side. So this one doesn't really have to do with contract drafting so much as just understanding the terminology. Amendment versus addendum. I'll be the first to admit that back when I was a real estate agent, before I was a real estate attorney, for probably, if I'm being honest, the first 2 years of my realtor career, I didn't really know the difference between an amendment and an addendum. And I think a lot of other realtors fall into that category of not really knowing what the difference is. Now, if you do know the difference, that's great. But for those of you that don't, an amendment is something that alters the contract after the contract has already been formed. So think of, you've got a contract, you do the inspection, and you find out, oh, we need some repairs. If you amend the contract to make one party responsible for making those repairs, that's an amendment because you're changing the contract that's already been created. Now, an addendum, we can think of it as an attachment to the contract at the time the contract was made. So a lot of times we'll have an FHA addendum, right? The buyer is an FHA buyer, they write up a purchase and sale agreement, and there's an addendum, basically an attachment to that offer that deals with some FHA requirements. So that FHA addendum is part of the original contract, and it is part of the contract since the inception of the contract. So it's not something that changes the contract later on. It was part of the contract from the beginning. So that's really the difference between the two. And that's just a terminology thing, but it can be important when you're drafting and when you're just trying to understand what these documents are and how they relate to each other. So the second part, or another part, is choosing a closing attorney. Very, very often we see that the seller's closing attorney is left blank, or there's a to be determined written in there. And it's easy to understand why, right? The buyer is writing the contract, and a lot of times the buyer's agent doesn't really know who the seller is going to use as their closing attorney. So they put the buyer's closing attorney down, but they don't put the seller's closing attorney down, and they just leave it to be determined. And there are some situations where maybe that's all you can do, right? You have to get that offer in quick, and you just don't have time to figure out who the seller's going to use, or the seller doesn't know. But 9 times out of 10, you can solve this by simply calling the listing agent and saying, who are you going to use for your closing attorney? And then you can write that in there. So take the time to do that if you can. It just makes it a little bit easier, and it makes it so that you don't have to later on add an amendment or something to add that closing attorney back in there. So final tip is stay up to date throughout the closing process. I think it's pretty easy for agents, especially when they get busy, to get the house under contract, to schedule the inspections, to do the inspections, and then once the inspections are done, they kind of just ease off the gas and just let everybody else take over and let the closing attorneys do their thing until closing. And while in a perfect world that is exactly how it should be done, right? The closing attorney should take over and do pretty much everything. The reality is that it's important for you as a realtor to stay up to date on the closing process, even after your role is somewhat done for the time being. So how do you stay up to date? Well, you should probably call either your closing attorney or the other realtor, or both, every couple of days and just check in, make sure that everything's on track, that everything is progressing the way you think it is, because you don't want any surprises. And if you can find out about a surprise or an issue early on, it's always better than finding out later on. Now, a good closing attorney, it's something that we do, is we provide you proactively. We're going to tell you, here's what step you are in the transaction, here's how they're progressing, so that you're never left in the dark and you don't have the obligation of calling us to find out where things are or how things are going. We're going to take that action and we're going to fill you in on the way. But if you don't have someone who's being proactive, then it's up to you to take that action and to get things done. So I hope this was helpful. These are the tips that we see seasoned agents basically utilize all of these. And if you're a newer agent and you want to, become a seasoned agent, or at least appear like you're one and act in a really top professional manner, these are some tips that are great and that you should use. Hope this was helpful.